So I started university about 10 years ago now, and I remember in those first couple of weeks of uni, I decided to try a church. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't decide to try a church because I thought it was the best thing for me or because I had a particularly strong faith. It was purely because I was getting that question from my parents of when are you going to try out a church? And I thought if I try one, maybe they'd just leave me alone and stop asking me. So I did a quick Google. I found the closest church to my hall's residence, and I rocked up one Sunday. And there wasn't really any students there. It was mostly older people, a couple of young families. And I met a couple there called James and Claire. And James and Claire, after the service, quite nicely invited me to their house for dinner, to hang out with some of their friends, to just hang out a bit. And then afterwards I went back to my hall's residence. It was quite lovely. Really nice time, good food, good company. And then I found out a couple of days later that maybe inevitably, I was having some issues with the student loans company. They'd lost some of my information and I wouldn't be getting my loan through until closer to Christmas than the start of term. And James and Claire got wind of this and drove to my halls of residence, gave me an envelope with £100 in it, just to see me over while I got some stuff sorted so that I could survive the first term. And I remember at the time, I was absolutely struck by their generosity because I was basically a stranger to them. They'd met me a couple of days before. They had no idea who I was. They invited me into their home. And then even beyond that, they came and gave me money when I needed it, without any expectation of what I'd do with it. I was a stranger, a student. I could have just gone and splurged it all on whatever I wanted, but they trusted that I would use that well. And as I reflect over the last 10 years of my life, I kind of realised that this idea of living generously is a trait that I see in people that look most like Jesus. I've been to loads of churches, met loads of Christians, and this characteristic of living generously is always something that the most Christ-like people seem to embody. And as I think on it, that kind of makes sense because in a passage of the Bible called the fruit of the Spirit, you can find it in the book of Galatians, there's this passage, it talks about the different characteristics that people who grow closer to Jesus will start to exhibit the more and more they grow close to him. And one of those fruits they list is goodness. It says that those who grow closer to Jesus will exhibit more goodness. At least it says that in some modern translations. In other modern translations, it uses the word generosity. And that's because the word it's translated from actually means something closer to kindness paired with action, which is a bit closer to generosity than goodness, maybe. So for me, if that passage tells us that if we grow closer to God, we'll start to exhibit more generosity, then this is probably something we need to take seriously. It may be something we need to start practicing so that we can look more like Christ. So my response to that, maybe yours is too, is, well, what else does the Bible say about generosity? Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 to 7, it says this: "Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." Now, the first thing I think that jumps out at me from that passage is that if generosity and living generously for us becomes a spiritual discipline, or it's something that we feel like we're forced to do, or we do it because we want to look good, or even because we want to get something in return, then by definition, it's not true generosity, because this passage says that we have to decide in our own hearts what to give, not under compulsion. So I guess if we feel like this isn't something that someone's going to force us to do, and if we feel forced to do it anyway, it's not really generosity, why bother? It's kind of optional, right? And I think that this passage also tells us that, because with every command in the Bible, there's often a promise with it. And the command here is to live generously, sow generously, give away generously. And the promise is that we will also reap generously. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is like a get-rich-quick scheme where if you give all your money to the church tomorrow, you'll be a millionaire by next week. I just don't think the gospel works like that. And it just doesn't gel with all the other stuff that Jesus said about money. Rather, I think that there's a promise here that if we give generously, if we live our lives with generosity, then there's a promise that we will see more of God's generosity here on earth in the form of his kingdom coming. So if you're maybe living in a season of unanswered prayer, or you're feeling spiritually dry and you're beating yourself up because you think you can just do better, maybe the response shouldn't be to try and one-up our spiritual disciplines. Maybe it shouldn't be to try and go to church more regularly, or to use better language, or to pray better prayers. Maybe the response should be to live generously, Go all out with generosity. Be as generous as we can be, because then the promise is that we will reap generously. We'll see more of God's kingdom on earth. We'll see more answers to prayer. We'll see more evidence of him working in the lives of our friends and families. And if you want that, and I definitely want that, the next question that jumps to my mind is, well, how do we do that? How do we live generously? And fortunately, we have a really great example in Jesus as to what it looks like to live generously, because he gave up everything for us. He was as generous as you could be. 1 John chapter 3 verse 16 actually talks about it. It says this: "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So this passage tells us that a life of living generously isn't just a command, it's a response to the generosity that we've seen in Jesus to us. Because he gave everything for us, our natural response, a loving response of pursuing him, is to be as generous as he was with the world we see around us. It's not just acknowledging needs. It's not just seeing that and be like, yeah, that really sucks. But rather, if you see a need and you can meet it, you go out of your way to meet it. And that might look different for everyone. It may be that for some of you, you think you can wrestle your budget a little bit, and you can maybe free up a little bit of money every week to give to a local church or organisation or someone you know in your community who's struggling. But it may also be that you have a particular set of skills or something that you're really good at that's in high demand at the moment, and that you could give away your time and your skills to a church or the SU or maybe even the NHS or something like that for free because you want to be generous with the skills you have. Even further than that, you might look at the situation you're in and you might see that in your house or on your course, it's got quite catty and people aren't really speaking well of each other. And you could live really generously with your speech and how you speak of other people. You could be known as someone who is quick to forgive or someone who speaks well of people behind their backs. And I think the secret here is that I can't actually tell you what the plan is for you to live generously, because that first passage in Corinthians tells us that it has to start with us. We have to decide in our hearts what we have and what we can give away. If I'm just telling you how to live generously, again, by definition, it's not generosity. You're just being obedient. Obedience and generosity aren't necessarily the same thing. So I've just got a couple of questions for you to discuss, and then I'm going to pray, and then you can go away and chat about them. So the first question is this: where in your life have you seen or experienced some of that Christ-like generosity that I talked about at the start? Maybe like James and Claire, you've seen someone who really went out of their way to be generous, either to you or someone else you know. Where have you seen that? What example can we be following? My second question is, what do you have in your life that you could give away? Be it finances, skills, words, a message. What do you have that you could freely give and you could live generously with? And finally, what would it take for you to make steps to be generous with that thing? It may be you need an introduction in an organisation to someone. It may be that you need to just sit down and work out your budgets. It might mean that you need to practice something so that you can get good at it and be generous with it. Chat about it in your group now, like, what do you have? What can you give away? And then actually make a plan to then go and do it and embody some of this command we see to live generously, because only then will we see God's kingdom come here on earth. Let me pray. Holy God, I thank you for your sacrifice, that you are the prime example of what it looks like to live generously. Jesus, I pray for everyone in this room now that you can help us to understand what it is you've put in us that we can be generous with. God, I pray that it's a little bit uncomfortable. I pray that it's a little bit of a sacrifice, because only then will it truly reflect, even to a small amount, what you gave to us. God, let's be bold in our conversation. And Father, let us see your kingdom come here on earth. In your name, amen.